Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call Agony, Part 1. So this was sort of a big project. It started as just a fun little doodle and then sort of got out of control. So we're going to go through the entire development of Agony and her weapon, and then a close-up shot of her and her horse. Now, if you guys don't know who Agony is, that makes total sense because I basically made her up. My son and I were playing through the Darksiders series, and I thought that it would be really fun to do a horseman, just to create a horseman. And I know there's already 4 of them, and we've seen all 4 of them, so I thought, okay, well, what if I just did this like theoretical Fifth Horseman? So that's where this character comes from. I wanted to make her a female because there's only 1 female of the original 4, so I thought it'd be cool if the 5th one was a woman. So now what you're seeing here is the initial ideation phase where I really didn't know where I wanted to take her, but I knew that I sort of wanted her to be big. I wanted her to be built similar to the Makers, although not quite as heavy. If you're familiar with the Makers from the series, that's sort of what the original idea was with sort of her general physique. And from there, I'm just sort of working out what she's going to look like. Now these videos are broken into 2 parts because a lot went into these. When you have sort of like a really detailed drawing, Procreate puts out a fairly lengthy video. So what we're looking at here is going to be the development of just the character, the original drawing that I did of her first. That's what this whole part 1 is going to be. And then part 2 is going to be the weapon design, the horse design, and then the close-up of her face that I just sort of did for this one big product. So as you can see here in the ideation process, what I'm starting to do is write down potential names for her. I think Darksiders sort of has a lock on some of the coolest names for characters and things, for horses and birds and everything. And so I sort of knew that I only had a few cool words that I might be able to go with. So I started writing some of them down as I was going. You can see I wrote down Slay, not super great, but whatever, and Havoc, which I like, but Havoc is already a fairly famous X-Men character, so I kind of didn't want to go that way. So you can see here that I sort of got her face down right away and knew where that was going to go, but then I wanted to start bringing in a couple of things that were going to make her special. So I wanted this like big scar situation that sort of goes across her chest, and then later I put it on her leg. And I was trying to figure out, you know, right now the various horsemen that have already been created, they have pretty strong color language associated with them. Even Death, who can wear a lot of different armors, you can sort of, when you close your eyes, you automatically know the colors that he is comprised of. Same thing with War, because War is a little bit more straightforward in terms of what he wears until you unlock like the abyssal armor, and then he becomes something quite different. So with her, even at this stage, I'm starting to think to myself, what is the palette for her going to be, and where can I sort of get like a couple of really cool accents in her design? So where I've got her design at this point in the stage is I've got this muscular female character who's not very happy. She looks like she's not really happy to be here. She's got this mess of tons of dreadlocks sort of all flowing down, and then one of those locks sort of is this big one that goes into a bead at the end there. And now I'm like, okay, I've got sort of the base her before armor. Let's start figuring out all of the armor. The Darksiders series, as with a lot of Joe Madureira's work, has a lot of strong asymmetry. So I wanted to bring that to this character. There's a couple of things that I'm not perfectly happy with in terms of where she went. I mean, obviously, when you work on something when you put a lot of work into something, you're always going to critique it after the fact, but in the time it worked out. I wanted her to have this massive right gauntlet, and you can see at the top I wrote, like, what are her weapons? Does she have fist weapons? Does she have an axe? Does she have a hammer? Very quickly, I move away from fist weapons because when I put that big guard on her, I sort of then figured, okay, well, I'll give her like a big axe or a big hammer, and that's sort of the leading arm when she's swinging the weapon, that could protect her and also do some additional damage. You see some of the rest of this design here goes fairly quick. Some of it just made total sense to me, and as I was scribbling things on, I was like, yeah, that's obvious and that's obvious. You can see here I go to put a headdress on her of sorts, like a headband, headdressy type thing. That's going to come and go a couple of times throughout this. Ultimately, I decide to just not go with it. Death from the second Darksiders has a mask, and War has a hood, but they don't really have much in the way of like armor sort of on top of their head. So I eventually just decide, let's make this about the character and get all the armor and stuff like that away from her face. So now the general rough has been done, and you can see I'm going in and I'm starting to do tight lines. Some of that is actually because I'm impatient at this point. I want to start drawing it. I want to start finalizing some things, even though not everything is completely solved. So not the best practice, but since this was all just for me, then it was possible for me to do that without much retribution. So later, I'm going to move to different areas, and when I get to those areas, they will be underdeveloped. And sort of as the artist moving through this thing, I get there and I go, oh, this is not finished. This is not nearly enough information in my rough sketch in order to proceed, so I have to fill this in now. At this point, though, I'm just continuing on sort of what I already know. I mean, you know, I draw a lot of human figures, whether or not it's totally perfect. I know how to do an ear, I know how to do a chin, I know how to do all that kind of stuff, and even sort of these dreadlocks, I've done something like this in the past. So for this, it's all just sort of, I wouldn't say that it's tedium, but it's a lot of, okay, I'm going to do this now for a while. By the way, I apologize for the quality of this video. It actually came out a little bit rougher than I had expected it to, and some of that's because this was a vertical image, and anytime you're doing a portrait in Procreate, it doesn't save it out at the highest resolution because it's sort of locked to the vertical pixels. But that's my sorry this looks so shitty sort of little message. So I'm going through the dreadlocks, just sort of doing these wrappings. It's obviously a stylized way of doing it, and I'm going through and basically I have the loose form of them in the rough. And then I'm just sort of going through and putting in all the loops first to try and communicate the dimension of each one of those strand locks. And then from there I'm going in and I'm saying, okay, now let's block out the actual exterior form with the line that goes around it. For those of you that like to listen to your own music, since these are such long videos, I decided not to put music in a large portion of these. So I hope those of you appreciate that. The other stuff will come back though. So all of the haters of the other stuff, you'll see that again. I promise. Just for you. So at this point now, I'm just refining this. It's a lot of the same, going over the same thing. In fact, it's sort of like how when you're drawing human anatomy, so much work goes into like feet, hands, and face because of the concentration of detail. And the same thing is true with this particular character, having all of these individual locks and having them actually representing sort of this like banding that's going around them. It ends up pouring a lot of focus into this stage of the illustration. At this point, I was probably zoning out, watching something, just praying for it to end, because it becomes very tedious after a while. But in a second, we're going to move to another area. So now we're down on the sort of right heavy main gauntlet. I've got these two giant curved spikes that are like teeth coming out of it. In general, for the design of her, to speak about the actual design, I referenced a lot of what's done in Darksiders with regards to the way War looks, a little bit, although not as much, in regards to the way Death looks. I looked at some of the other demons. I looked at the way Absalom looks. I looked at all these sort of various characters to try and figure out, okay, what's something that could be a little on the fresh side while still feeling like it exists in that world. If I was doing this professionally for a gig, I would have done a lot more revisions on the armor. I would have done, you know, I don't know, 15 different super roughs to try and figure out sort of what she was going to look like. But I thought that I had enough for my own personal enjoyment of doing this piece. So you can see there's things that aren't 100% the same, but they speak to it. Like her glove looks a little bit like the way some of War's armor looks. And this these big plates sort of going up her arm. They might be a little bit war, but they also might be a little bit like some of the demons or something in that world. And I was trying to ride a fine line with this character because when I first posted her, I referred to her as the disgraced Fifth Horseman or something like that. I have no lore at all wrapped up in this character. I didn't do any kind of, like, I didn't come up with a backstory or anything. All I know is that she is, I just refer to her as the Fifth Horseman, and that she's no longer one of them, and who knows why. So that's sort of the idea behind her. So she doesn't have a lot of logic, actually, that went into her design, something that I really love to do a lot. This was much more around the idea of just trying to make sure she felt like she existed in that world. Very similar to the Kingdom Hearts piece that I did where I drew my son alongside Sora and Donald and Goofy. This was all just powered by the fact that my kid was having so much fun playing the game, and I thought it'd be fun to draw something that kind of goes along with that without just drawing a character. So you can see me struggling right here with this face. Now, a lot of the armor in the Darksiders series have like faces and like animal faces, human faces, demon faces, like lots of really awesome design elements. And so I started doing one here. That's what this is right now. But it looks really off. It looks like it's maybe like Pacific Islander or something. It just doesn't fit with the most of the gothic stuff, the demonic stuff, or just the faces in pain kind of thing that they've got going on in the Darksiders series. You can see an eyeball popped in there for a second. I was just sort of trying to toy with what is this going to be. So ultimately, I copped out a little bit, but I still went for something that I thought was going to be nice looking, which is this just big tooth skeletal face made out of metal. So that's sort of where it went. And then in order to sort of support those design elements, I put these leather straps that are coming up and around, and they're stamped in and all that. I would say that if I was going to try and solidify some of her core elements, it would be all of the pyramid sort of studs that I've got going on throughout the entire thing. That is a big element of her. She's got those in sort of her face piercings. She has similar elements to that sort of echo through other things, and then you can see there's like 4 big ones right there. And then when you actually get in on the little rivets that are keeping that leather in, they're actually pyramids as well. And so that was sort of the idea behind her design elements. She has somewhat of a little bit of a demonic look, demonic in the world of Darksiders, and I was sort of thinking, I don't know if that is 100% part of the backstory, but I thought it'd be neat if that had ties to her backstory, that she actually had aspects of maybe demonic armor, or maybe armor that came from some of that, or whatever, you know. Like I said, I wasn't really solving her. I wasn't really coming up with a backstory for her, but it really helps when you're designing a character to at very least come up with some reasons as to why things exist. At this point, I've realized that my main color keys are going to be warm, that she's going to be warm sort of across the board, and that I would use gold in a couple of spots for pop, and that I would use something very bright and not necessarily truly warm for her scars. I figured that out by now because I'm trying to think ahead while I'm working on this. So I'm looking at all this armor. The armor, I don't really know exactly what the color is. I just know I want it to be on the warm side. I know I'm going to be dealing with a lot of metals and leathers and things like that, and that I would maybe make the scars bright blue or bright green or bright yellow, although yellow's warm, just something that felt really intense and it would stand out against everything else that she was, basically. So at this point now, I've decided to work on the shoulder pad. You can see I do a sort of supporting ruff in there because the original ruff was just too rough. And so there was a little bit of, okay, let's figure this out sketch that went into that. And now I'm going in and doing tight lines over that ruff to get this to a place where it looks cool. So in order to keep with the reoccurring themes, I got a face going here. It's got a face with some horns. It's going a little bit on the more demonic side, but you can't really see the demon's face all the way, but he looks a little bit more pensive, a little bit serious. He's not like roaring and screaming, because I didn't want to get to the point to where she had too many like teeth elements sticking out of her like the demonic stuff does. I wanted some of that, but I wanted to make sure that she still felt like she could have been one of the horsemen, and maybe in fact some of the armor that she has that looks a little bit more of that like violent demonic look, that maybe that came after she was no longer a horseman. So that's sort of where that all of that goes. Right now I'm just putting these horns in, trying to make them look interesting on some level. Now, it's probably around this point that I start thinking to myself, I want this to look like it exists in the Darksiders world, but I'm not matching things one to one. Like, I'm not looking up a lot of art and doing it's mostly from memory right now, and then every now and then I might bring up something from the Darksiders world in order to look at a face, or hey, like for instance with that face that I said looked like it could be Pacific Island or something like that. Like I looked at that and I'm like, this isn't going to work. We need to go with something a little bit different. So without obviously copying like some face in anguish that's on like War's armor, I wanted to go with some other things. So I'm not 100% looking at Darksiders' work right now. I'm just sort of keeping it in mind. Later when I do the horse, I'm heavily referencing Darksiders stuff because I probably have never drawn a horse in my life all the way through. I've probably just doodled one or done like a head or something, but nothing major. So I really needed to lean on both regular reference, regular meaning non-Darksiders reference, and then Darksiders reference, so I could make sure that horse looked like it could sit next to Ruin or Despair and just coexist with them. We haven't seen Strife's, we haven't seen Fury, well, we haven't seen Strife either. We haven't seen Fury's horse in the games. I don't know if they appeared in the comic books at all, but so I don't have them to base anything off of. It's basically just the demon horses and then the two riders that we've been able to play as so far. So here I'm getting that scar laid in. I want that scar to ultimately be super flat so that it stands against everything that has dimension to it. You can see that on her sort of, it's not really chest plate because it's not like one big plate, but like her chest armor, her torso armor, that's starting to speak much more towards War's armor. If you look under the cloth that War is wearing, draped over his shoulders and stuff, he's got this like black sort of tiered armor that's really tight to his body, but you can see that there's a thickness to it, and I wanted to bring some of that into this character. Death is very medieval looking, I feel at least. He's much more fantasy. His game is much more fantasy, whereas War feels like he was designed to exist both in the fantasy and in the contemporary post-apocalyptic side of things. So I wanted to bring some of what War had into her because she was already going to have so much armor. It only makes sense to keep her a little closer to War's vibe than Death's vibe, I guess. My son and I beat the games throughout the sort of course of me working on these characters. It wasn't until I started working on the horse a few days ago that we actually wrapped up Darksiders 2, and now he's constantly asking me when Darksiders 3 is coming out. And he's 4, so he doesn't really have the concept of what next year means. So I had to, his birthday's in January, so I was like, the next time you have your birthday, it's probably 6 months away from that, which obviously he can't, it's not like he's got concept for that either, but he's excited. That's the important part. He wants to see it. So yeah. So here we've got that cloth coming down. Some of the best stuff in Darksiders character design is that mix of armor and cloth and skin and just all these materials layering together. So I wanted to make sure she had a sash cloth element that was going to be slightly different than what some of the other characters have had up until now. And then she's got this big ass belt buckle. It's a little on the flat side, I admit that, but I wanted to get that in there. And so now I'm going in and I went to put the skirt, the sort of like sarong type thing that she's got going. But then I realized that I hadn't finished the hand. So now I go in and I'm applying a tighter ruff to the hand so that I can then go in and actually do some clean lines and finish that one off. So there you can see some of those pyramids jumping back in again so that I can try to maintain some of that design element. And it'll come again later, but I just wanted to point that out there as a reoccurring theme. So here we are defining the sarong-like cloth that's coming down, and this is where I'm also thinking more about color, and I'm trying to figure out what this will play, what role this will play. It's fairly detailed cloth in the sense that there are lots of folds going through it, but comparatively to the armor and all the other stuff, it's like these giant swaths of flat shapes, basically. So I have to start thinking, is there a way that I can use this intelligently when I'm doing the colors? So right now I'm starting to build an idea of she is mostly going to be warm colors, then she's going to have some sort of a bright color for the scars, and then she will have her sort of secondary main accent color being this big cloth. I was also designing her in the mentality of being like War in the sense that she wouldn't change armor that much if in fact you played as her. So she's not really designed to be too component-y, although that could always change. Here we're getting down to the feet. I had just an impression of the legs in the sketch, and now it's like, oh shit, I gotta actually figure these out. So that's what this stage is. You can see in that in her left knee pad, there's a bunch of little scribbles in there. That was going to be like a bunch of little faces, similar to the way like Chaos Eater looks in Darksiders 1, but it just doesn't really fit her character. So even though I got a skull on her right knee pad, when I get over to the left knee pad, I actually just reduce that down to armor plates that are similar to the interior of her right ditch on her right elbow, or like some of the other smaller elements. I tried to stay away from too many trinkets on her. She has a couple, but just a couple. I wanted her to feel aggressive and utilitarian, and she's a warrior. I kind of want her to be much more of a warrior than even War was. War, I believe one of the developers of Darksiders 3, who I think was also on the other ones, he mentioned that War sort of had everything, and Death had speed, and then they were saying that Fury has magic or something, or maybe she sits somewhere in the middle. I'm already misquoting it, so definitely don't quote that. But so if you're sort of looking at all the horsemen as a spectrum, and then I would assume Strife, who uses guns, is fairly quick, I would actually want her to be very slow and very heavy, almost like the triangle button in Darksiders 2, the heavy attack button, that's sort of like all her stuff. You would obviously need to mix her up a little bit, but it would just be awesome to have her be just heavy, moving through the world, like you're driving a truck through the world. So now we're putting some glyphs on her little foot covering thing. I don't know what that part of the armor is called. That is obviously a staple of Darksiders stuff, is to have these sort of things, these little runes, these little glyphs all over the place. So I started identifying a couple of opportunities for me to do that on this armor. I do it there. I do it on that big bead that's on the end of her longest piece of hair, and I do it in a couple of other spots. And then later when we get to the horse and the weapon and stuff, I do it there as well. So right here is just finishing up the left knee pad, and then I'll go into finishing up sort of the rest of her leg. You can see on the end of that knee pad, although it's a little bit curved, it's still that sort of pyramid shape. You can see the pyramids going around on the tip of her boot. So even though we're trying to introduce fresh stuff throughout, we're also trying to start locking down our language, the shape language, the armor language, and all that. So when you look at the way the sort of like between the knee pad all the way down almost to the sole of her boots, that all patterning looks similar to what she has around her torso. And that ultimately is also what I will have on parts of her left arm. So that's all following sort of a similar vibe. Then you've got this pyramid element that's sort of going through everything in order to try and unify some of that design. Then you've got the glyphs that are, so these are like a lot of different elements, but by sort of placing them in the right spots, using them throughout and as even as possible, and then you're using big shapes to try and get some of your differentiating silhouette, then what you can do is you create something that feels like it was all conceived as one whole, as one big thing, and that the character will feel like there's a story being told through their armor, but that you're not introducing just tons of random elements of armor all the time. It should be fresh, but it should feel like there's a reason to this. Now, one thing with Darksiders characters is they always look like they've collected their armor from all over the place to a certain degree, and that actually is what tells the story. When you see a character in one of these worlds and they've got just like a flask at their hip, it looks like it's the great flask of something, and that it means a lot to even have that. And I think that War has excellent design in that regard. And then when you go into Darksiders 2 and you actually get some elements that are like pieces that might look like they come from War, they might look like there's like the story that goes behind each piece. And that's what you sort of want a Horseman character to look like. You want them to look like they've accrued their armor over time. If I were to draw, let's say, Agony year 1, the very first time that she was ever whatever. I don't entirely understand the lore of how you become a Horseman, but let's just say she's back at the beginning. She probably doesn't have that big skull armor piece. She probably doesn't have that dope knee pad with the skull on it. She probably doesn't have that shoulder piece. She probably doesn't have a couple of these things. It's much more understated and it's less special looking, and then over time she sort of gets these trophy pieces of armor. So now we're over to the other arm. I wanted to have this sort of, it's a little bit of a weird thing with the armor. It's not like the weirdest thing ever, but I wanted these pieces that felt like they were a little bit lifted off of her body, like if you crashed into them, they absorbed a ton of impact. So I went with a little bit of an irregular armor setup. So instead of her having like this big shoulder piece, because she's obviously got to show off her dope-ass scars, I put this piece that sort of looks like a shoulder piece a little bit lower to protect her bicep. And then, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, you can also see all that shading coming into it. I decided that I wanted to start doing that. It was a little bit late in the game, but I decided I wanted to do that. So that's why there was a bit of like this shading pass that sort of suddenly like started appearing across everything. And now you can see me doing it in the individual armor. So anyways, to get back to the armor, I wanted to have these pieces. So I have that piece that comes down and protects her bicep. Then I have this other piece that it looks kind of like it's floating, but the understanding is that it's connected underneath in some manner. And these are removed a bit from her other main armor in order to imply that there's some play there, and that when they actually get impacted, they sort of get pushed in and then resist out kind of thing. So when you're looking at now the rest of this armor, some of this armor is metallic looking. I'm shading it in a way where it looks metallic. I don't know why I wrote like bleh across the page like that. I must have been like done with the piece by then. But you can see here I'm putting in all this shading, but there's still a lot of what's going on with that part of the armor that feels like the other side. Even though it's much more form-fitting, it's not this huge fist. It still feels like it goes along with some of the other things. So trying to pick up on the shape language of all of the other armor and add new stuff at the same time. So you see those sort of wraps got put in there just to add some character. Maybe the armor chafes her on the arm, so she put wraps there. Maybe she had more scars, and so she has a wrapping there to cover it for some reason. But I just thought it'd be interesting. And then we echo those wraps down by her leg as well. So here we are putting in a couple more pyramid spikes on her hand. Some of them are similar to the way they are on the other side, but in the understanding that all of this armor is super custom, they are also a little bit different. There her wrist was a little weak, so I adjusted her wrist to be a little stronger. Now we're finishing off the big lock that comes down, getting some tight lines on that bead, starting to put some glyphs going around that bead. And then I'll have the loose hair at the end that's just sort of flaying out, that hasn't been all sort of like wrapped up and dreadlocked. You'll also notice across all the armor, I talk about this in other illustrations, but you'll notice across all of the armor there's lots of damage. Obviously we want this to look like she actually uses this in battle, so we want to put damage and scratches and all this all over it. It makes it look like she used it and that it's been hurt, but that it's still around. It sort of implies resilience and that it's a tangible thing that actually can change over time instead of being pristine and perfect. So here I'm just going through and adding a couple of thicker lines by the leg and making sure that some of the shapes are reading by increasing some of the line thickness. Then I put a little bit of shading on that leg armor there. And now we're going in and actually adding in some of the belt. I put this like weird artifact here on the side, and then in the middle of working on it, I realized that her arm largely covers the entire thing. So it's just sort of like this weird thing. I don't even know what it is. So I can't explain this one. That's it. It's just a weird thing. Right there is where I realized that it mostly gets covered. So I erase it away. I add a couple of these little things in there, cover it with a huge shadow, and now there we go. If I were going to go back and relive portions of my life, that artifact might be one of them. Then we've got a little bit of like a vial of something back there that's got a little bit of runes etched into the leather that's holding on to it. And now I'm doing the dreads that are falling down behind her so that those are creating a shadow to sort of punch her out a little bit. So her leg was never finished, her actual bare leg. So now we're just finishing the bare leg. We're adding that other scar on there. Then I realized, oh shit, it gets covered by the armor. So I moved that scar up a bit. It'd be awesome to show her before the scar and just this like brutal attack that like left her that way. So Absalom has some scars across him when you actually face Absalom, and I realized in the middle of this that that was pretty similar. I didn't want it to be too similar, but at the same time I was pretty committed at this point to this sort of look. Absalom luckily goes on a little bit more of the yellow side, and he doesn't have as many gashes in him, I don't think, if I remember correctly. So I felt like I was pretty okay here, and that her ultimate look and feel was going to be so different. None of the rest of the palette or the look and feel was similar, so I thought it'd be okay to sort of stick with these sort of bright things. So now we've got some rocks and everything at the bottom, and then I'm writing some more names, and then I go, Agony, perfect. I'm going to go with Agony. So I'm so excited that I came up with the name Agony that I started doing some high school notebook metal style logo for her. And that's what all this is. You'll see just a couple little tricks here and there here where I sort of create like a bar and then I duplicate it and flip it and then I create another bar and then use that bar elsewhere. This is really just because Procreate doesn't have as many tools for this type of stuff as Photoshop does. So I'm just doing a couple of little tricks here and there to try and make sure that I can cope with it. So you duplicated the G in order to create the O, fairly simple. And then even duplicated that O to create the N because that seemed like that was going to make sense. And then at the end we throw the Y on there and then get some fire and we are good to go. You probably caught there that I duplicated the lines and blurred them and then lowered the opacity. You may have seen that sort of flicker by. That's what I did in order to present the lines. That does come back again in the color, but not right away. So at this stage, what I've done is I've duplicated this file in Procreate so that I can sort of keep that thing alive as just the lines and I'm not going to mess with it. When you duplicate it, it brings all of the video footage with it anyways. And so now I'm flatting it. I'm going to take those lines and I'm going to convert them to a color by selecting their layer and then creating a new layer and then filling that in with the color that I want, and then I'm going to set that to multiply. That's going to end up absorbing the color underneath into the lines above. This is something I've explained in other videos much more thoroughly, so you can go check those out. Right there you can see it's set to a bit of a purple, and then I set that to multiply and lower it from there. So for this, I went with her base skin tone as my sort of core selection for the entire thing. because what I'm trying to start thinking about, this is a fairly complicated character, but what I'm trying to think about is the character in layers because of how I'm going to work. So I use the select paint, select clear method, which is linked down below, so you can see that. Right now I'm just clean flatting the entire thing because I know that with as complicated as this character is, Procreate's not going to handle the amount of layers that I'm going to need in order to really make this painterly. A lot of the stuff from Darksiders is fairly painterly, so what I tried to challenge myself with was, if I went with a flatting method and then a shadow method, could I do something that looks at least somewhat painterly? I don't think I really nailed it because I was kind of rushing it. Like I'll admit I was kind of rushing the coloring on this, but I still think it came out pretty good, and it sort of comes out looking a bit like a piece of concept art. So I think it works. So for colors here, you'll see that the flats are what I said before. We've got yellow as a main pop on the cloth. We've got the green as a main, as a really strong pop for that scar, and then the armor is all more or less the same color, and I'm going in and putting these accents around it that are still fairly muted though compared to the yellow on the sash. So now using the armor that I flatted all in that gray as my core selection for the armor, I'm now going in and applying a then sort of next level up in terms of value metal. That way I can start breaking out some of the shapes. Things can pop a little bit more. And then you can see like the gold that's part of her piercings, as well as those buckles. Those are pretty vibrant. I wanted to bring that gold in because there's not a lot of gold in some of the other like the war design and everything, and I thought that that could be fun. And you'll see these colors adjust a lot as I go, because once I start adding in the shadow layer and the highlights and all that kind of stuff, it becomes much more apparent as to how it's going to ultimately look, and I want to obviously control the qualities of what I'm going for here. So you can see there I put green in for these glyphs, and then I'm like, that's stupid because that doesn't make any sense. So I put the gold back in, because it doesn't. The reason I say it doesn't make sense is because the green's coming from these scars and her eyes and stuff, so why would that be a part of her armor? So now you saw that big blast scribble that went across everything. That was me testing my shadow, what I was actually going to, what color am I going to use for my shadow, which ended up being a super light purple blue. You saw that flash by there for a second. It actually gets even lighter than that by the time we get further along. So even though this is a fairly long video, some of this is going to fly by pretty quickly. You can see I'm starting to paint in the shadow around her face, and you'll see me sort of tweak that color a little bit as I go. Throughout the entirety of this, I'm tweaking what the actual color is for the shadow and then what some of the colors are for her flats in order to make sure everything's reading as clearly as possible, and to make sure that like some of the elements like the armor might want to come closer to each other than further away from each other. So I'm not going to zoom in too much during this process because you're going to see I jump sort of all over the place. Since I'm dealing with my base flat first, which I said was her skin, you see I'm just working with her skin right now. And so everything is just focusing on skin, skin, skin. Then from here, I move up my layer stack, which you can see on her left arm is that value of metal. So now what I've done is I've selected all of that metal, and then I've cleared away from my shadow layer, and then I've selected it again so that it's trapped by that, and I'm working on it. Again, if you look at my select paint, select clear video, which is linked below, you'll see a very simplistic explanation of this, and then all you have to understand is that I'm doing that all over this thing from here on out, basically. And I'll do it again when I do the highlights as well. So right now I'm just moving up through my layer stack, making sure that I'm getting shadows on everything. So we are still in the sort of core armor color, the core gray color right now. And instead of using a super soft airbrush all the time on this one, I'm actually using the harder brush as well that has fall off in order to try and capture a little bit more of the painterly stuff, get a little bit more of a almost accidental hard edge here or there. That way it doesn't look like it's just too soft overall. So right now we're on her right arm, on that main metal right there. You can see some shadows being cast. You can see right there I created a new layer in order to tweak a couple of things and then merged it back in. And now we're working on the horns on her shoulder pad. And really all I did was go with a top-down lighting. Wanted to keep it straightforward and simple. She's just sort of standing here anyways because she's a fairly straightforward character design presentation. So I wasn't going to do anything too crazy with the lighting right now. And now we're sweeping across the darkest layer of her armor. You can see there on her chest we just got some in, and then on the pad over on her left arm. And now we just cleared from the next level up, which is that the lightest of the grays that isn't the stark metal that's on the teeth over there. And you can see I'm filling in all of that right now. One thing to note is because of the select paint, select clear method, you see that shadow that's coming off of the her right fist's biggest spike. It ends really crudely over that sort of orange trim right there. That's going to get adjusted once I eventually get to the orange trim. It'll be cleared and then elaborated on. So now adding some dimension to the various faces, we now just cleared the teeth on the skull, and now we're just adding in the shadows on that part. See, that was all mostly leather stuff, and now here we are. We've just cleared the orange, and we're going through and applying the shadows on all of the orange trim right now. And then we just cleared it on the yellow. And now we're doing the yellow cloth aspects. And after I do the shadow here, eventually, I can't remember where in the process I do it, I actually add a bunch of grunge to that as well. Yeah, right there, okay. A bunch of grunge to it as well, just to start making it look a little bit more lived in and not like this pristine piece of yellow cloth. You'll also notice there's no shading at all on the scars. I wanted the scars to have no effect from the light. They're you know, self-illuminated. And now we're on the hair. The hair, weirdly enough, because of the way this entire thing was built, I actually put on the topmost layer. So that's why they didn't get color. It didn't get colored till now. Now we're adding a little bit of that glow on the scars. And you can see here I'm painting in this sort of like background really crudely. This is a fairly simple process. Just pick a brush you like and then move sort of through the values to create that sort of halo. And then I added white over it just to knock it back a little bit to bring some importance back to the figure. So now we're switching to the highlights. So the shadows were all done with a really light purple set to multiply, and the highlights are done with a really light yellow set to soft light, but then really reduced in opacity. I think it's like 30%. The layer is set to 30% opacity. So it's pretty light at this point. And I'm moving through it in the exact same order that I did before, starting with skin and then moving up through my layers in the order in which they are stacked. Now this process is faster than the shadow process because the shadow layer actually gives most of the dimension across the entire thing. In fact, you could probably get away without doing the highlight layer, but meaning you can get away with it in the sense that most people won't care. But by adding a little bit there, you can control the dimension just a little bit further and then try to imply various things in the materials as well. Now, I haven't identified it yet, but I know that across certain aspects of these two videos, there's going to be times where the app crashed on me and I lost some progress. So I apologize for that. There's nothing I can really do except to work much smaller, which I probably never will. But you can, you'll notice it when there's like a huge jump and you can't really see what had happened. I don't think it happens really actually on this character, except maybe when I go to do the coloring on her name. But I know that it happens on the horse and I think the weapon as well. So when I edit these videos, I'm actually looking at the video on a much smaller scale than you guys will look at it. So right now, I hope you're seeing all the little changes that are darting across the image. I actually can't really perceive that right now because the image is too small. I think I just saw some movement up by the horns. So if you want to look at those horns on, yeah, there we go, up on the shoulder pad. That's where this is happening. Just trying to sort of pick the edge out on those horns to sort of bring it forward. And really, in order to try and do a little bit of the matching of the style to Darksiders, although at this point I would say that I'm not really matching style, more just matching sort of the same general art universe of Darksiders. I'm also trying to just call out lots of edges, try to bring dimensionality to it, try to make everything look like it's heavy and chunky. That's my main goal, especially with the highlight layer. Okay, and now we're going to try and slow this down even more because this is where all the crazy stuff happens. So you can see some shine was just applied across some of the gold elements down by the boots and the bead. And now we're going to get into some atmospheric stuff. So I start adding, you can see that black layer got put on her entire body and then erased away and lowered in opacity. And now what I'm doing is I'm color picking aspects of the background and painting those on top of everything on her, and then lowering the opacity on that to start putting her in some of that atmosphere. You can see there's some of it put in, there's a bunch of bloom around her entire body lowered in opacity, and there's that little separation that got added in between her two boots. If you rewind, you can see where that happens. And otherwise, this is just sort of dressing the image with that sort of white that's happening on the edges. A lot happens in that little bit, and it's pretty easy to follow actually if you rewatch it, I think. So if you have any questions though, feel free to post them. So there you go, her name just popped into existence. That's because it lost that part of it. But anyways, there's her design. I hope you dig it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, please consider liking and subscribing. And remember, she is one of the horsemen of the apocalypse, so we have more to look at. So on the next video, we're going to look at the horse, we're going to look at the weapon, and we're going to look at a close-up headshot of her just to add a little bit more character. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.